If you woke up in Paris around the year 1300, the first thing you would notice would not be Notre Dame. It would be the smell. Mud, horse dung, smoke, wet wool, fish, urine, and bread ovens all mixed in the same air, even in the shadow of the cathedral. This city held one of Europe's greatest churches and one of Europe's greatest schools, yet daily life still ran through gutters, markets, and rented rooms. By the end of this video, you will know what medieval Paris looked like, sounded like, smelled like, and why survival there felt so uncertain. Start with the ground under your feet, because medieval Paris was built as much from mud as from stone. Inside the old parts of the city, streets were narrow, crooked, and uneven, shaped by centuries of slow growth instead of one big plan. On the Isle de la Cite, and in older lanes on both banks, upper floors pushed outward over the street and blocked light. After rain, carts, hooves, and boots churned the road into thick mud that trapped wheels, soaked clothes, and slowed every delivery. In dry weather, that same street threw up dust, dung, and bits of rotting waste, so there was no clean season, only different discomforts. Royal and city leaders tried to regulate dumping and street cleaning, but rules were easier to write than to enforce in crowded lanes. Kitchen slops, chamber pot waste, butcher scraps, and craft runoff could end up in drains, ditches, cesspits, or directly in the street. Some houses, monasteries, and colleges had latrines, but ordinary urban hygiene still depended on leaking pits, open gutters, and luck. That is why the city felt so enclosed. Timber walls, hanging signs, smoke, wet cloth, and trapped air all pressed together in the same passage. The smell changed block by block. Near smiths you got hot metal. Near butchers you got blood and offal. Near dyers you got soaked wool and urine. And yet one smell could cut through all of that misery: fresh bread, drifting out from ovens and stalls into hungry streets. Bread mattered because, for most Parisians, daily life was measured in loaves, grain prices, and whether there was enough coin that day. Many people also had to think about water in a very practical way, because it had to be fetched, carried, bought, or taken from doubtful sources. That simple need shaped the day. Every bucket cost labor, time, and one more chance that dirty water would reach the household. Common people lived on bread, pottage, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, and whatever small extras they could manage, like cheese, eggs, or cheap fish. Wine and ale were common drinks partly because water quality could be uncertain, though what you drank still depended heavily on status and means. Better-off homes ate finer wheat bread, more meat, more spices, and more kinds of fish, not just because of hunger, but because status showed at the table. Paris could not feed itself. A city this large depended on steady supplies from the countryside, from roads, carts, bridges, and river traffic. When harvests failed or transport broke down, fear rose fast because bread prices could climb before wages did. Les Halles, the great market district, was where that pressure became visible. Bakers, butchers, fishmongers, fruit sellers, and tavern keepers crowded the food trade. Markets were not just places to shop. They were places where officials checked weights, measures, bread quality, and spoiled meat. A bad loaf, a false measure, or rotten food could mean punishment, because feeding Paris was a political problem as much as an economic one. For the poor, the smell of bread was not always comfort. On days without work, it could be a kind of torture. That same divide shaped housing, and medieval Paris placed rich and poor under the same skyline, but not under the same conditions. Wealthy churchmen, nobles, merchants, and master artisans could live in larger stone or mixed stone and timber houses with courtyards, storage, and upper rooms. They might have feather beds, chests, metal tableware, devotional objects, and even a little glazed glass in some windows. They still lived in a smoky, crowded city, but they had walls, servants, and stored goods that could soften the worst parts. Some wealthier homes also had courtyards or separate kitchens, which helped keep part of the smoke, clutter, and heat away from the main room. Poor households had almost none of that protection. Many rented a cramped room, a loft, or part of a fragile timber building. For them, cooking, sleeping, storage, and work often pressed together in the same air with no buffer at all. One room might be bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and storage space all at once, with barely any privacy and constant damp. Beds were costly, so many people slept on straw pallets, benches, or shared bedding instead of proper framed beds. Winter cold crept through shutters and walls. Summer heat made smells stronger. Vermin and fire were both constant threats. Fire mattered because dense timber buildings, furnaces, ovens, and close-packed roofs made urban disaster frighteningly easy. The poor lived closer to the street in every sense. Thinner walls meant more noise, less sleep, and no real escape from carts, shouting, or animals. Students knew that harshness too, though in a different form. The University of Paris drew learners from across Europe to the left bank. Modern viewers might picture a calm campus. Medieval students got rented rooms, rough hostels, debt, arguments, bad housing, and a busy working neighborhood. The university was famous, especially for theology, but the streets around it were still full of taverns, labor, smoke, and noise. Bells mattered here as much as books. They told students, workers, and worshippers how the day was moving from prayer to trade to rest. That mix made Paris unusual. In one short walk, you could move from high learning to raw hunger without ever leaving the city. A public procession could pass beside muddy ruts, hungry workers, and rented rooms in the very same hour. Religion tied those worlds together, because church life was not a Sunday-side activity. It ordered time, sound, law, and hope. Bells marked the day. Feast days and fast days shaped the calendar. Processions stopped traffic and pulled eyes toward the street. Notre Dame was not simply a beautiful building on the skyline. It was a living center of clergy, ritual, relics, and public authority. Church power reached into contracts, marriages, burials, and public oaths, so religion shaped law as well as prayer. Parish churches, monasteries, hospitals with religious ties, and mendicant friars all helped shape how people worked, studied, begged, married, confessed, and were buried. Ordinary people met religion in candles, saints' days, sermons, tithes, guild patron saints, and fear of sin, purgatory, and salvation. The church also helped the poor through almsgiving, hospitals, and confraternities, but charity was limited and never erased hierarchy. Clergy could preach mercy while institutions held wealth and power, so faith and inequality stood side by side in daily life. Work filled every part of the city, and you would hear Paris before you ever understood it. Hammers rang from smiths. Carters shouted for space. Bells answered bells. Animals cried. Bargaining rose from market stalls. Workshops opened directly onto the street, which meant labor was not hidden behind doors but spilled into public view. Bakers, butchers, shoemakers, masons, carpenters, fullers, dyers, parchment makers, tavern workers, washerwomen, carriers, and boatmen kept the city moving. Guilds organized many of these trades. They set rules for training, quality, and entry, usually through the path from apprentice to journeyman to master. Guild life could shape more than income. It could shape friendships, training, neighborhood identity, and even devotion through a trade's patron saint. That system could protect standards, but it could also lock people out if they lacked money, contacts, or the right opportunity. Women worked throughout this city too, even when records give them less space than men. They sold food, brewed drink, washed clothes, spun thread, stitched cloth, kept shops, served in homes, and sometimes ran workshops as widows. Many newcomers came from the countryside looking for wages, because even a dangerous city could offer more hope than a failing village. The Seine made that hope possible. Wood, grain, wine, stone, and other goods came through river traffic and related jobs on shore. A shoemaker might sleep above the shop, and a tavern keeper might live inside the business, because home and work were usually stacked together. That closeness meant the place where you slept could also be where you cooked, stitched, stored scraps, and met customers all day. When weather or war disrupted supply, the shock traveled quickly from boat to market stall to family table. Disease then turned every weakness in the city into a daily threat, long before the Black Death arrived. Crowding, dirty water, waste, parasites, poor diet, and close contact with animals all raised the risk of illness. Diarrheal disease, lung infections, skin problems, fevers, tuberculosis, and childbirth complications were common parts of urban life. Childhood was especially dangerous, which is why average life expectancy at birth looked so low in the medieval world. That low average does not mean most grown adults died at 30. It means many babies and children never reached adulthood. Those who survived the early years could live into their 40s, 50s, or longer, though poverty and hard labor cut those chances down. The poor could not simply rest through sickness, because missed work often meant missed bread and deeper debt. Medical care existed, but it did not work like a modern hospital system. Paris had learned medicine, practical surgery, herbs, and religious care side by side. Hospitals existed, but many were closer to religious houses of care than to modern treatment centers built around cure. The University of Paris gave the city major intellectual prestige, yet university learning did not remove pain from ordinary homes. Wealthier people had better access to trained physicians. Poor people more often relied on barber surgeons, household remedies, charity care, or prayer. People did not know germs, but they were not foolish. They saw that bad air, filth, stagnant matter, and crowding often went with sickness. Learned medicine often explained illness through humors, corrupted air, and even the stars, yet observation still mattered inside that older system. Then, in 1348, the Black Death hit Paris and magnified every urban fear that had already been there. Exact numbers are hard to pin down, but the plague almost certainly killed a huge share of the city's people. Labor broke, burials mounted, fear deepened, and the religious response intensified because plague did not invent insecurity, it exposed it. Even without plague, hunger could weaken bodies quickly. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 hit northern Europe and would have shaken Paris hard. Scarcity, higher prices, and failing strength turned an ordinary food problem into a citywide danger, especially for workers living from one day's pay to the next. That is the sharpest truth about medieval Paris. Grandeur rested on very fragile daily survival. Survival depended not only on what you earned that day, but on whether supply lines held, prices stayed steady, and your own body held through winter. The same city that built cathedrals and trained famous scholars also depended on laborers whose shoes filled with mud, and whose meals could vanish with one bad week. Clothing showed that divide plainly. The poor wore coarse wool or linen, often patched and worn thin by work and weather. The wealthy wore better wool, richer dyes, furs, and tailored garments that signaled money before a single word was spoken. Night made those differences even harsher, because darkness in medieval streets carried real danger. Watch systems and curfews existed, but enforcement was uneven, and theft, assault, and fire stayed close enough to shape behavior after sunset. For newcomers and day laborers, that danger sat beside rent pressure and sickness, so one bad week could break a household. Students, taverns, laborers, and armed retainers could all add to disorder, so city authorities kept issuing rules about waste, building, food, and conduct. Medieval government was not absent. It was active and worried, but it lacked the clean reach and steady enforcement a modern state expects. Seasons changed the city's mood as much as politics did. Winter meant cold rooms, short days, fuel pressure, and rising danger for the poor. Spring and summer brought more trade, more insects, and stronger smells. Autumn tied hope to grain and wine arriving from outside the walls. Over all of that sat the church calendar, with fasts, feasts, and processions giving the year its sacred rhythm. If you walk Paris today, you can still catch pieces of this older world in Notre Dame and in streetlines on the Isle de la Cité. Later rebuilding erased more than old houses. It erased much of the cramped physical logic that once forced bodies, animals, and trade into the same tight channels. But stone is the easiest part of a city to save. Smell, noise, crowding, fear, and hunger disappear faster than walls. Medieval Paris was not only a postcard of towers and stained glass. It was open drains, smoky rooms, fever beds, busy workshops, and bread lines. It was bells at dawn, mud underfoot, and the daily gamble that your work, your food, and your body would hold through another winter. If you want the next chapter of city life made real like this, watch the next video, because medieval streets only get stranger after dark.